Pandemics are far from perfection when it comes to having to make decisions quickly. And can I tell you hand on heart that one of the most difficult decisions I've made personally and the government's made during this pandemic has been closing the New South Wales-Victorian border. It was a decision of last resort. And in fact, I remember getting heavily criticised for not moving earlier. And one of the main reasons we didn't move earlier was because we knew the disruption and angst it would cause people in the border communities. And for all of you, you don't see yourselves as a state border, as two communities, but one. And I deeply appreciate what that government decision has resulted in terms of the disruption and angst felt by many. And I want to say how deeply I regret everybody's challenges during this time, but please know you're not alone. We've had many people on both sides of the border, within the border communities and outside the border communities, who've been deeply impacted by the pandemic. And as the Victorian numbers continue to decline, that gives us greater confidence to ease restrictions and to listen to the concerns raised by border communities. Can I, on this occasion, thank a number of community leaders for their support. Firstly, to my parliamentary colleague, Justin Clancy, who has been outstanding. Please know that he has very much been on the side of his community and raised with me almost initially on a daily basis, but certainly at least every couple of days through direct phone calls, meetings and other forms of communication, the concerns expressed by his community, especially when the initial 50-kilometre zone was reduced and the impacts it had. And I regret deeply the fact that the community wasn't prepared for what we had to do at that time. And I want to assure everybody that Justin's advocacy until this point in time has been outstanding. And any frustration people feel should be against me and nobody else. I'm the leader and the buck stops with me. And I want people to appreciate that every decision we take is in the interests of our citizens. The alternative to what we did could have resulted in high rates of infection in rural and regional New South Wales, not just on the border communities but throughout the state. And we have had a few close calls in respect to the virus seeping into or seeding into regional communities and border communities. But our health officials have done an outstanding job in contact tracing. I also wanted to acknowledge Justin's colleague on the other side of the border, Mr Tilley, for his advocacy, and I know his community is equally anxious about the changes that have occurred. Can I acknowledge Superintendent Smith and all the local police officers who have done an outstanding job, and we were just commenting outside that I don't think either of us expected to be in this situation, but he's leading about 500 men and women of the New South Wales Police Force in supporting our border restrictions. And I also want to thank the members of the Australian Defence Forces who still have around 400 people on the ground, and thank them for their unstinting support. Often they're the ones that have to face the public every day. They're the ones that have to face people who feel let down or frustrated, and I just wanted to thank them on behalf of all the people of New South Wales for their efforts. And please know that we appreciate everything you have done. Pleasingly, having obviously heard the sustained concerns of the community and seeing the rates of infection in Victoria decline, from this Friday, the border community, the border region, will be extended to that initial 50 kilometres on either side of the border. Service New South Wales and the community has a few days to adjust to that. We wanted to make sure that unlike previous changes, we gave as much notice as possible so that people would be able to start planning ahead. Of course, any movements outside the border communities comes with additional restrictions, but in terms of people being able to tend to their daily life without unnecessary stress, we hope from Friday life will change in a positive way for people. But as Superintendent Smith mentioned to me, we've had an excess of 1.2 million movements, to and from the border communities in the last 6 weeks, and that's a large number of movements. But having said that, we appreciate that from Friday life will be much easier and less stressful for people living on either side of the border. I also want to add, and I don't make this as a criticism, but I just want people to appreciate where we're coming from. Is it has been difficult for us to get information on the other side of the border about rates of testing, community transmission, and that has in part led to our angst about how we can move forward. It's really important for us to understand what's happening on the other side of the border, and I know my counterpart, Premier Andrews, is going through a difficult time, but pleasingly the numbers are coming down, and that gives us greater confidence in relation to what's happening alongside the border communities south of the border. Unlike our side of the border, we know that if we have any suspected cases or contact tracing or testing, we're able to jump onto it straight away. We don't have that level of confidence on the other side, only because we're not in charge of the system on the other side, and therefore we have to make sure that we're not introducing unnecessary risk into our regional communities here in New South Wales. We've also made sure that we've supported the Victorian government in any way we can, because the risk to New South Wales and to our border communities is greatly reduced when the number of cases in Victoria come down. And of course we want that to be sustainable, and we hope once restrictions in Victoria are eased that they're able to maintain that level of low number of cases, because that is what will ensure that we don't need to leave the border open a single day more than what we have to. I mean, that is our aim. I was very hesitant in closing the border, but we won't be hesitant. We won't leave it a day longer than we need to, but we have to make sure it's the right thing to do at the right time, and it's in order to make sure we keep the community safe. And I'd rather be having this conversation with all of you today than having a conversation about why there are hundreds of cases in regional New South Wales because of what's happening in Victoria. And that's certainly a conversation I would never want to have. What we've done at all stages during the pandemic, especially in the last 6 or 7 weeks, is make sure we didn't go down the path of Victoria. And that's why we worked overtime, because now, even though I know it's frustrating for many people in this community, and also in Wodonga, and along 27, or there's 55 places where you can cross the border, but 27 main ones. And we know how stressful it is for everybody along those communities, but think of the alternative, which would have been, had we had to have shut down New South Wales, none of us would be moving around as freely as we are. Businesses wouldn't be able to do anything. And so as difficult as it's been, please know the decision of the government, my decision, was coming from a place of good intention. And of course, as I said, we won't leave the border closed for a day longer than we need to. I'll now ask my parliamentary colleague Justin Clancy to say a few words, and then happy to take any questions. If they're operational, I'll ask Superintendent Smith and members of the ADF to support me in that, but otherwise happy to take any of your questions. Justin?
Premier, I would say welcome to the border. And I say the border because I know from our conversations and from your deliberations, it is not just Albury that our focus has been, but all the way along the border. We've been considering the Upper Murray right through to Mulwala in the west of my electorate, but even further west to the communities such as Echuca, Moama. So this has been a challenge for all of our communities. I want to, in that sense, also acknowledge the front line, the police, the ADF, Service New South Wales, and those who have joined in the advocacy for our border communities. So organisations such as Business New South Wales, Australian Industry Group, local government, who have all been championing the cause of our communities here on the border. Premier, it is good to have you here because our communities have been tested. And for me, to our communities and to the Premier, I say that our communities have responded so well to what has been a real test. It is testament to the strength of our communities. I know that there are people who are impacted, and it is good in that sense to acknowledge the hard work of our community on both sides of the border. And in that particular respect, I want to thank the communities to the south of the river as well. To your point, Premier, we are very much one community. We look forward to your visit here. We look forward to the sense now of moving forward, the lifting of restrictions, but as we move forward, also looking towards recovery and a rebound for our communities on the border. Thank you.
Premier, the Deputy Premier was here last week and he said the New South Wales Government makes no apologies for the border closure, but will you apologise for repeatedly blindsiding border residents here, particularly critical workers and education permits that were cancelled overnight?
Oh, look, I've said absolutely. I regret the way in which the community didn't feel that they had sufficient notice. And in fact, sometimes the health advice evolves extremely quickly. And I never want to look back at a point in time where the Premier of New South Wales has ignored the health advice. Things in Victoria change very quickly, and we had to adopt and change very quickly. And my heart goes out today to anybody who's experienced any kind of stress. But please, can I also say how deeply grateful I am, not just to the police and the ADF, but Service New South Wales, who had to also be the front line. The Service New South Wales team in Albury I'm incredibly proud of. I'm going to meet with some of them later in the day just to thank them. They're the ones who had to get a permit system up and running within a couple of days, and I know how frustrating that was for many people, the workers, but also obviously for our citizens. And I also want to acknowledge the great work done by James McTavish, our New South Wales Border Commissioner, because he has held on my behalf and with Justin's support, consultation with local business groups, local government, many other members of the community who perhaps we couldn't talk to directly as soon as we got the health advice. So I'm deeply grateful to all the people on the ground who in my stead have brought everybody together to highlight the concerns, to raise the concerns. And I deeply acknowledge and regret anyone who's experienced unnecessary hurt or angst, but please know that any decision we took was from a place of good motivation, was to keep everybody safe, including our border communities. And until this, and as I said earlier, until today, we're starting to get a bit more information from regional Victoria, but I want to be very honest about that. We don't have complete transparency on what's happening on the other side of the border because we don't control that health system, we don't control the contact tracing and the testing. And so we've had to rely, and I don't begrudge the Victorian government because obviously they've been in crisis management mode, and perhaps we're not top of the list in terms of what they need to address, but we're certainly starting to see a better flow of information. The case numbers are coming down in Victoria. We're seeing a better flow of information on what's happening in the border communities, and as a result, that's why we can move forward with Friday's announcement. And again, my heart goes out to anybody, including our frontline workers. Many community members have been at the forefront and the brunt of community frustration, and when you've been a community leader for a long time and then you have to implement a policy which you know is going to be received under very difficult circumstances, it's a difficult situation. And please know that I hope my visit today is a sign about how much I care about this community, how much I care about our border communities. We are all this together, and that's why before my government took the decision to close the border, I consulted with the Victorian Premier, I consulted with the Prime Minister. We came to the mutual conclusion that this was the best thing to do all round. And I have to say, it's a different approach to what I've experienced on our northern border when I've still not had a conversation on the northern border. But certainly down here, I felt that even though it's been difficult for many members of the community, that we have tried to make the process as easy as possible, and I hope the decision from Friday will make a positive difference to people. And to Justin's point, which I think is perhaps a really important point, is we are now looking towards recovery. We are looking towards how we can establish or re-establish normality for all of our communities across the state, but in particular our border communities. And please know we appreciate deeply that the state border doesn't really exist here. You are one community. And I acknowledge everybody who has reminded the government of that day in and day out, and we've tried to respond acknowledging that very important factor, which is, I think, unique to all of Australia. If you look around Australia, I don't think there's a border where the communities feel as one as much as here. I don't think there are two states that have had as much to do with each other for the last century as New South Wales and Victoria. And that's why it has been a very difficult decision, a difficult process. And I want to really thank everybody for their patience and acknowledge your frustration, your angst, and also say that I think it's completely justified, because if I was in your shoes and something changed overnight which was going to impact my life, I would feel let down and I'd feel disheartened and concerned. So I completely empathise with what many people in our communities have felt.
Premier, when do you expect the border to reopen altogether? The Deputy Premier said last week that he expected it to be by Christmas time. What indicators are you looking at there to make
Sure. Well, obviously we're looking at case numbers, but can I make this point? And I make this point again, not as a criticism or a comparison, but just to say what is really important is to see what the case numbers do once restrictions are lifted in Victoria. We want to have confidence that once restrictions are eased, the virus isn't spreading again. And I think that's really important. And again, we won't leave the borders shut a day more than it needs to be because it was a very difficult decision to do it in the first place. And as soon as the health advice to me says, Premier, it's no longer a health risk, I will, my government will jump at that opportunity. But
is that fair to say that it won't be open in time for the school holidays coming up?
How long? That's in 2 or 3 weeks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, I don't want to foreshadow what I've learned in the pandemic. Is the health advice is evolving. The pandemic, every week we get different updates and different challenges, and I know that stage 4 restrictions in Victoria will undergo some change, I understand, from the 13th of September. So we'll look very closely as to what happens during that time. But one lesson we've learned also from the Victorian experience, and this is really, really important, every week we learn lessons. We know so much more today than we did back in March or April. But it's also to note that mobility or people moving around is what does spread the virus, and we want to have confidence that once Victoria eases restrictions, including in regional communities, that won't cause further angst about case numbers. So again, the health advice is evolving. I don't want to put a timeline on it, but please know our sentiment, the will of our government, is not to have the border closed for a single day longer than we need to. Because we appreciate the angst it causes communities.
You mentioned community leaders just earlier. We've got the Albury Mayor and Wononga Mayor both here. They both said that they only found out about this visit today, to the media. Was there any reason why they weren't included or invited?
Oh, look, what I wanted to do today in particular was to thank all the frontline workers, to meet with a number of local leaders. I'd love to be able to meet with every single person during my day trip, but I also acknowledge...
Surely the local mayors, though, would garner an audience?
Oh, look, I appreciate that sentiment, but I also know that they've been in regular contact with our health officials, with Mr McTavish, with the local MPs. So please know that whilst I haven't been able to meet with them directly today, that they are in constant contact with various leaders. And so please know that's the case. And please also know, and again, this has been a 24/7 job for me and my government, and we've just made sure that we make decisions on a daily basis which keep everybody safe. And there's so many more people I'd love to meet. In fact, this is one of the very few trips I've made outside of Sydney. In fact, I think it's the only second one outside of Sydney since the pandemic began. So please know that all those things factors are considered.
There's been concern in relation to the numbers...
Oh, sorry, you haven't asked a question yet.
Would you like to see similar arrangements with Queensland? You mentioned the northern border.
Well, yeah, I think it's really important for all of us as leaders, no matter what political background we have, to work together for the benefit of the local communities. I mean, absolutely, and certainly if I was closing, I don't think the public has appetite, and I certainly don't have appetite for any public bickering. But I think it's really important for us to be talking to each other. And certainly keeping each other informed. And I know that my office and Premier Andrew's office are in constant contact to make sure each of us are aware of what's going on, because any decision he takes affects my communities and vice versa. So I think it's really important to keep those lines of communication open, but it also gives us confidence. If we're sharing information, if we're trying to help each other out, it also means that we can make decisions in the best interest of our citizens with confidence without kind of being worried about what circumstances we don't know about.
We have noted that at times permit changes were made overnight without any warning. Can you explain why now that there's going to be some easing we're having to wait 7 to 10 days for that to come?
Oh, it's much... good question. When the health advice is that you have to close a border or tighten a restriction, that's almost immediate and you have to act immediately. But taking restrictions off is easier. You can plan ahead for that. And I went through this similar experience back in March when the state was in lockdown. So it's actually much quicker, and you have to respond to the health advice. When the health advice says, Premier, this is a risk, you have to act today or tomorrow, well, then obviously you do that immediately. But when you're easing restrictions, you have a bit more time to contemplate the circumstances, to try and make the process as easy as possible, and also to give the Department of Community Service, Service New South Wales, the time to actually put the system in place so that residents have greater clarity than what they would have done previously. So it is a very different process. Shutting something down is quicker and more dramatic because of the sense of urgency. And I recall that, I was thinking about the border closure between Victoria and New South Wales for a good 2 or 3 weeks before it happened, because we only did it absolutely when we had to, when the health advice was unequivocal. So we were watching on standby for a considerable period of time, and it was only when I got that phone call at 8 o'clock in the morning from the Health Minister and the Chief Medical Officer with the same advice, with a sense of urgency, we had to act immediately. But now that we are coming out of that process and it's very much in recovery mode, that we're able to take the time to provide the community with enough notice, to provide our emergency service personnel and our Service New South Wales frontline and community leaders enough notice to ease those restrictions.